Space and time are the two key axes of history. So, a small anecdote, perhaps to help you understand this. In my first year at Cambridge, I was writing an essay question about the First World War and about the Eastern Front, the Western Front, and I think the question was about why the what was most significant in helping the British win the First World War, something along those lines. And this was a huge question because, as I mentioned, it covered the Eastern Front, the Western Front. It also covered, the US. It could cover almost any part of the world that was involved in the war. And also at the same time, it kind of made you think, is it should it only be, confined to the parameters of when the war started and ended, or could you even start to think about before the war? Were there certain economic conditions produced in the later, 19th century, which allowed for the Brits versus the Germans with the significant food shortages to win? So I wrote a very modelled essay on this where I tried to define space and time, but I didn't really do so very concretely. And my supervisor at the time told me that with this kind of question, like the one for the John Locke essay competition, where you can pretty much write about anything that you want because you're not specifying a certain time period and you're not specifying a certain country or continent, you need to be you need to be precise on what you choose to look at. So the lucky thing with this really is that you get to define what you want. As long as you're looking at the later 18th century as a certain hinge point, you can look at, for example, you could look at pre and post colonial Africa. You could look at the differences between Europe and China, which are a big part of the historiography, and it's something that I will look at later in the videos on a theory about this topic. At the same time, you can pick out the time periods, right? And you can compare, what was China like in the later 18th century versus Africa versus Europe. And within Europe itself, could you point out certain parts of Europe which has certain factors which allowed economic growth to be either more stagnant or stronger after the later 18th century? So the idea of variation is really, really important. And this is where you can follow your intuition, right? So it's much easier to write an essay competition like this, which is only 2,000 words, if you're not cramming in every single thing you could possibly find, because that's impossible. That's like trying to write an economic history of the world before and after the later 18th century, which is impossible in a 2,000 word essay, unless you're honestly just writing down and summarizing everything that happened without producing the analysis. That's the kind of thing someone will be writing in a 2,000 page book, not a 2,000 word essay. So choose which parts of the world you're going to look at carefully and choose the temporal parameters. And you need to make sure that this will include examples before the later 18th century, examples after the later 18th century. And even within the question title itself, they've been very vague actually about what the later 18th century means. Because in historical terms, that could mean anything from between the 1750s to really to really just the beginning of the 1800s to the 1790s. So you might actually say that the decade that you want to use as your hinge point is the 1790s or the 1780s. And depending on what you choose as your explanation for what economic growth looked like, then you can choose quite precisely the day, the year. So if you're looking at the Industrial Revolution, you could say in the UK, you could say it was this specific year in the UK that you want to use as your hinge point.